Okay, so we're over here in Jeremiah, and we are going to be going through chapter 34 through 39. Now, if you were reading did the reading last week, you're 2 chapters shy of what we're going to cover, and the reason for that is me, not Josh. I told him to have the reading go through 37, not all the way through 39, and now I'm going to try and cover some extra ground, and we'll see how well I do on that. But next week's reading, chapter 40 through 52, you notice that is 13 chapters. You're welcome. We have got one more week left in this class, and just do the quarter and trying to get it all done. You will find in next week's reading that a lot of that are prophecies about other nations, and what we'll do when we cover that is cover it fairly quickly. So don't expect to spend a lot of time on those chapters next week. But here, as we go through, we're going to be looking at Zedekiah quite a bit tonight. And Zedekiah is a complicated guy. He is the last king in the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. And because of that, he is the end of an era. And he is also not of the lineage of the Messiah. So if you take Coniah or Jehoiachin up there on that chart, these kings have multiple names just to make it more fun. Jehoiachin or Coniah is the last guy who will be in the lineage of Jesus that sits on the throne of David. Zedekiah is an uncle, and so he's already a vassal king of Babylon. Babylon's come in, they've been exerting their strength, and Zedekiah has rebelled several times against Babylon. Babylon has decided to finally come up and wipe them out. And because of that, Zedekiah ends up being the last king. So in chapter 34, which is where we'll be picking up in Jeremiah chapter 34, there's going to be some prophecies against Zedekiah, as well as the fact that as we progress through this time period, Zedekiah shows up a lot in many of these chapters here, because he's the guy who's king when Babylon falls. So that's just kind of an element that makes him special just purely because of the timing. What you'll find with Zedekiah is that he is, as I said, complicated. He will at times do the right thing. He will at times do very much the wrong thing. He will call for Jeremiah to be killed at certain points. Then he'll change his mind about that. He will call for Jeremiah so that he can ask Jeremiah, what does God say? What should we do in this circumstance? Babylon's outside knocking on the doors. How do we handle that? What does Jehovah say? So sometimes you go, man, he's doing the right thing. He's asking one of the prophets what's the right thing to do. But then as soon as Jeremiah tells him what to do, he typically won't do it. So he's complicated. And my question to you is, why would we look at a guy like that? What's the value in the complicated nature of his character and looking at it from a biblical view? Like, why do we as Christians study these guys who are a mix like this? And class done, right? I mean, it's right. That is the summation of it, isn't it? We're complicated. And you'll notice he's what I would call a complicated bad guy, right? So Zedekiah, he's pronounced as being somebody who did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, which if you go through the Kings and Chronicles, pretty much every king gets an up or a down vote. King Josiah was king, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. King Hezekiah was king, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. King Asa was king, and he did what was right in the sight of the Lord. Jeroboam was king, and he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord. So every king, their whole life gets summarized in one bit, right? You either did well or you didn't do well. But life itself is more complicated than that. You look at Zedekiah, and he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord, but on any given day he might have. Right? So your life becomes the summation of the whole of who you followed. In the case of Zedekiah, what are some words as we were going through these readings and looking at him and some of the different prophecies about him and things that Jeremiah says about him, what are some words that you could use to describe Zedekiah? Yeah. Unreliable. Okay, so we got two words so far. Complicated, unreliable. Fickle. There's another word. It's kind of a fun word, fickle. That one will actually show up in the sermon on Sunday. Didn't know that you were going to use it, but hey, fickle, it's a fun word. Any other things that describe Zedekiah? Yeah, so there's another element, proud. Yeah. And he said, so he comes and he calls for Zedekiah when things are dangerous, but then ends up doing the opposite. So there's a pride there. What also does it tell you that he calls for Jeremiah? At least when things are difficult. It tells you something else about his character. Right, so there's a certain basic level of knowledge, right, that Jeremiah speaks the words of God. So there's, what he does with that knowledge, as you said, is fickle. But so you've got a guy who's got a certain level of knowledge, a certain level of pride, but he's unreliable and inconsistent and complicated. How many human beings could you describe that way, though? All, and now you're back to what Perry said, right? We're complicated. So the danger that we can run into as we study the prophets, this is the most dangerous thing that I think we can do, is to say, that doesn't apply to me. I'm not like Zedekiah. But everybody runs that risk. Because everybody has seen moments in their life where they allowed pride and inconsistency in their character to rule the day, right? And you look at somebody like David, at times could you not say about David that he was a complicated person? And sometimes unreliable? Right? Sometimes his character did not match up what he said it was supposed to be. Right? Pride ever get in David's way? Absolutely. Right? But what we care about is the end of the story. David has one end of the story when confronted with those things. Zedekiah has a different end of that story. So in chapter 34 in particular, as we look at Zedekiah, it starts in verse 1 by saying, the word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord when Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army with all the kingdoms of the earth that were under his dominion and all the peoples were fighting against Jerusalem. When he says all the people that were under Babylon's dominion, at that point it is most of the known and civilized world. So this army that's come up against Jerusalem at this point to lay siege to it is the world's great superpower. And almost everybody has given into the dominion of Nebuchadnezzar. And so they have now surrounded Jerusalem and against all of the various cities. Now, if you look up there, I've got kind of a tiny map up in the corner. It will describe later on that there are only 3 fortified cities left in all of Israel by the time we get to chapter 34. Now, all this is not chronological, so we're going to actually hop back in time again, and that makes Jeremiah a little bit more complicated of a book. But at this point in time, when Zedekiah is going to have a prophecy given to him about him, there's only 3 fortified cities left in all of the nation, which means all the population of the southern kingdom is in one of those 3 cities, or they've surrendered. Because that's what you do. When you invading army comes in, everybody runs to the fortified cities and they go and hang out there. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you've never read Lord of the Rings. That's just how that works, right? Everybody runs to the safety. And so there's only 3 safe places left. And Jerusalem is the safest of those because it's the most fortified city in the best location. And so Nebuchadnezzar has now surrounded those cities, and in particular is fighting against Jerusalem. And God says, go and speak to Zedekiah, king of Judah. And you tell him, this city's going to be lost. That's a foregone conclusion. You are going to lose. Now, he does tell him that that he will die in peace. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because there's even the end of Zedekiah's life is complicated because he tells them that when he dies, he's going to die in peace. And down in verse 4, he says, you will not die by the sword, you will die in peace. And as spices were burned for your fathers, the former kings who were before you, so they will burn spices for you, and they will lament for you. Alas, Lord, for I have spoken the word, declares the Lord. So, Zedekiah, you're going to lose, but you will not die in this battle. One of the things that I think is interesting for us to see in something like Jeremiah is that as you're looking at the kings, the thing that God tells them over and over and over again, especially by the time you get to this stage of history, is the only way for you to be successful is to quit pretending you're successful. The only successful thing that Zedekiah can do at this point is say, I was wrong, I give up. That's the only way he does anything successful at this point. Otherwise, every moment that he continues to try and hang in there, you know, what's going to happen? The nation's under siege, the city's surrounded. Every second he waits, people die, right? So it's a good example, I think, of the repentance issue. Is that we, the thing that God asks us to do is sometimes the one thing that we just don't want to do, which is say, I was wrong. Any thoughts on that before we move to a totally different subject in chapter 35? Okay, so chapter 35, in the midst of all of this, we have a chronological thing where we go backwards. So here I'll go back to that timeline again. In chapter 35, it'll say, the word which came to Jeremiah from the Lord in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah. So if you look up on that map, there's Jehoiakim. So he's 2 kings earlier. So in your mind, you have to go from Zedekiah, and they're surrounded by the siege works, and the nation's going to fall at any moment. Now go back 2 previous kings before Babylon has done any of this stuff. And so during this time, we have this account that's thrown in here about the Rechabites. And they are sons of Rechab, and their dad, at some point in their history, had made a vow for the family. And if you look down in verse 6, he says, it tells you what it was that they did. They said, we will not drink wine, for Jonadab, the son of Rechab, our father, commanded us, saying, you shall not drink wine, you or your sons forever. You shall not build a house, you shall not sow seed, and you shall not plant a vineyard or own one. But in tents you shall dwell all your days, that you may live many days in the land where you sojourn. And so it goes on to say that family that came from Jonadab and his father Rechab, they became a group of people that was what they were known for. They didn't drink wine. They didn't build houses. They lived a nomadic lifestyle. And the only reason they were in Jerusalem at the time was when Babylon started showing up on the scene and things started to seem not safe. And so they came to Jerusalem. And the whole point of chapter 35 is, this is a big ask. Imagine for a second that you had a great-great-grandfather who said, all of my descendants should never, ever buy real estate. All of them must always live a nomadic life. So your great-great-grandfather made this proclamation. How many of you are going to follow that several generations later? If it's me, I'm going, well, great-great-granddad was kind of crazy. So we're just going to do what we want, right? But they did the opposite. They made it a part of their family identity and culture. And so they lived this nomadic lifestyle just because great-grandpa said so. And in chapter 35, that's his whole point is, you will accept the command and tradition of a man and honor that. And we see people do those sorts of things all the time. I mean, we're coming up in the holiday season. How many people here have holiday traditions that are just there because previous generations have done it? Right? I've got them. Am I the only one? Right? We've all got them. And we just accept these things. Like, this is what we do because this is the way we've done it. And yet, I mean, let me give you a weird one. For me, it was years before I ate in an IHOP. Years. And it was purely because my dad drove by an IHOP one time and he said, Buyers don't eat there. No commentary whatsoever. Later on, I found out he'd had a bad experience. But in my mind, that was literally it. Drive by, there's an IHOP, buyers don't eat there. Okay, buyers don't eat at IHOPs. Then I went later on when I kind of figured out, maybe I don't need to follow that. I went with Jenna, we had a bad experience, haven't been back. He was right. But these are things that we pick up, right? We will do that with human beings. In chapter 35, his whole point is, you'll do it with a human, but you won't do it with God. God who created you and made you, he gives you a rule, and you go, I don't know. But these people did it for a man. Here's my question. Why? Why will we listen to a person in our family lineage, but we will kick against the goads when it's God? Okay, so one aspect of it is just the plain old visibility. Any other reasons? Is that the only reason? Because we can see a human being and we can't see God. Okay, so if you don't obey a person who's right in front of you, see if I'm understanding you correctly, there's immediate consequences, or tends to be, right? King tells you to do something, yes sir, or off with your head. But with God, there may not be those immediate consequences, okay? So, yeah, I'm much more likely to pay attention if I feel like I'll get a whooping right away. Yeah. Any other thoughts? So you got a family culture and identity, and like you said, it's steeped, and it's from baby, right? Like it's ingrained immediately. And that like brings up all sorts of things about how important the Lord's family is, right? To steep yourself in that so that you have another family that you're afraid of letting down, you know? Yeah. Great point. Yeah, and it does start right away, and it's almost intangible with family stuff. It's just everywhere in the way that it's just always there. So, yeah, did you have something or just agreeing? Yeah, I agree too. It's a good point. Yeah. You can wear sandals with socks? Because that's very Pacific Northwest. Yeah. It's just a thing, right? And it's just something that the patriarch pronounces, and so there's a respect for that, and now you're back to not laying the family down. You have all of that kind of feeling. Yeah, okay. So we can understand why it happens, and we can articulate it, but we also then need to take it to the next level, which is what he's pointing out in chapter 35 is, okay, if you would do that for your earthly fathers, how much more so should you for your heavenly Father, right? And then there's another interesting element to make it a little bit more complicated here is that group of people that had followed great-great-grandpa, they're actually rewarded by God for that, because they had a greater sense of loyalty to at least somebody. And God says, okay, I'm going to bless that family. Down in verse 18, he'll start and he says, Jeremiah said to the house of the Rechabites, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, because you have obeyed the command of Jonadab your father, kept all his commands and done according to all that he commanded you. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Jonadab the son of Rechab shall not lack a man to stand before me always. God doesn't say everybody should follow this man's traditions, but he does say, hey, good on you as a family to at least have been cohesive enough to have loyalty to your ancestors. Isn't that an interesting bit? Because that seems to point to this idea that God does value at least generic family loyalty is better than somebody who's totally disloyal. And I would argue that I think part of that at least comes down to if you have somebody who can be loyal to somebody, namely in this case family, maybe that will translate over to being loyal to God. Maybe we can take that skill and apply it to spiritual things. But if you're disloyal to everybody in your life, I mean, you can't transfer that over to God, right? So there's an interesting added element here about honoring parents and how God finds that useful. And after all, who is the one who designed honor father and mother, right? That's not a man-made idea. That's a God-made idea. Any thoughts or comments there? Right. Yeah. So, in chapter 36, we're back here in the 4th year of Jehoiakim. So, once again, look at that timeline real quickly. A couple of kings before the end. And in this particular section, Jeremiah is under some sort of house arrest. He is not allowed to move about freely. And so God will tell Jeremiah, I want you to write some stuff down. And so in verse 4, Jeremiah called Baruch, the son of Neriah, and Baruch wrote on a scroll at the dictation of Jeremiah all the words of the Lord which he had spoken to him. And Jeremiah commanded Baruch, saying, I am restricted. I cannot go into the house of the Lord. So you go and read from the scroll which you've written at my dictation, the words of the Lord to the people in the Lord's house on a fast day. And also you shall read them to all the people of Judah who come from their cities. So, Jeremiah writes everything down that God has given to him, hands it to Baruch, or actually he dictates it to him, so he is the guy who actually writes it. And then he says, you go take this scroll. I can't go into the house of the Lord. I can't go into the temple, but you go and you read what I wrote. Well, from experience, what Jeremiah writes, good news or bad news? It could be bad news, right? So whatever he reads, this is not going to be stuff that people want to hear. After all, that's likely why Jeremiah was restricted from going in the first place. Oh, we're not letting him in. He only has bad news. So he goes in and reads it. Well, he goes in and he reads it, and the king hears it and hears about it, and the king says, let's burn that. I don't like what the guy wrote. We're not going to let him read it anymore, and we're going to burn it. And then, through the rest of the chapter, God says, fine, I'll replace the scroll. We'll dictate it again. We'll rewrite it again. And then the same thing is written all over again because, God can do that. Burning one copy doesn't get rid of it. So, several different things from here that I want you to notice. One, Jeremiah's dictation to Baruch shows us the power is in the word and not in the speaker. Right? Does it matter that Jeremiah physically is not there to prophesy and that it's somebody else reading the prophecy instead? Doesn't make any difference. Doesn't change anything at all. I find that deeply comforting because guess what? Your whole Bible is a dictation, isn't it? The whole thing. None of this is our prophecy. This is all handed down to us on scrolls that the Word of God that God gave directly to other people and we've gained indirectly. So when we read it and follow it and proclaim it, guess what? Same power. It's the same amount of power as if the Apostle Paul was saying it. Is that not wild? That you and I have a Bible and that when we say what it says, it is just as powerful as if an apostle himself had said it. It's still God's Word. So that's the first thing. And then there's quite a few lessons that can be learned from the fact that God had him write it down. And then, it gets burned and everything. The one is, just because Jeremiah was restrained doesn't mean the Word was. Right? Can anybody think of any other examples where a person was restrained and yet the Word still sounded forth? Paul, when? Yep, so Paul wrote letters while he was imprisoned. Any other people? Stephen, explain. Yeah, that's true. Steve, so you're talking about the fact that he was killed and we still have his words? Yeah, that's right. He dies and the word spreads everywhere. That's the very next thing we read in the beginning of chapter 8 there. Yeah. Anybody else who was restrained and yet their word went forth? Yeah, absolutely. So, yep, just they're in prison, and yet see, God is not restrained by our restraint, right? He can do whatever he wants and do it however he wants. So that's the first one. And the second one we talked about, Baruch, was just as impactful as Jeremiah. So it doesn't have to be the guy, it has to be the word. And then the third one is the scroll was destroyed, right? So the physical medium that the word was on was destroyed, but the word wasn't destroyed. One of my favorite false prophecies of the world is Voltaire, who was a renowned atheist, said that within his lifetime, Christianity was going to end. The guy died. Some people who wanted to print Bibles bought his house and turned his house into a printing press for Bibles. That is God having a sense of humor. Look, people have been trying to destroy the Bible, destroy the Word for a very long time. This king, Jehoiakim, comes in and he says, burn the scroll, and then we get rid of the prophecy. That's not how that works. That's not how any of that works. And so there's a lot of confidence that we can have in that the Word is not bound by any particular copy, right? That's one of those things where every once in a while you hear people bring up arguments about, the translations are becoming so bad. And there are bad translations of the Bible out there. Don't confuse me. But I don't think we need to worry about the argument that there's going to be only bad translations of the Bible out there. Right? I don't think it ever gets to that point because we're not in charge of it. God is. He takes care of His Word. Okay. Then, ultimately, you look at King Zedekiah. So we keep moving forward. And a couple of different things here. Chapter 37, we move back to that last king, Zedekiah. And Nebuchadnezzar is in Judah. He's surrounded everything. And Jeremiah gets imprisoned during this time period. In verse 11 of chapter 37, it happened when the army of the Chaldeans had lifted the siege from Jerusalem because of Pharaoh's army. Jeremiah went out from Jerusalem to go to the land of Benjamin in order to take possession of some property there among the people. We'll not spend a lot of time on that. I think Josh covered that. While he was at the gate of Benjamin, a captain sees him and he says, "You're going over to the Chaldeans." And then ultimately he ends up being imprisoned. In verse 17, King Zedekiah sent and took him out of that imprisonment in that dungeon. And he said, "Is there a word from the Lord?" And Jeremiah says, "There is." And then he said, "You will be given to the hand of the king of Babylon." So this is a kind of this constant thing from Zedekiah. Jeremiah gets thrown in prison. Zedekiah then goes, "Hey, what do you have to say?" And he goes, "I do have a word from God. You're going to be taken into Babylonian captivity." And so this goes back and forth, and all the people around Zedekiah in particular, they don't want Jeremiah around. He's bad press. He's going to make people upset. And that's what you find in chapter 38. So he's been thrown in a dungeon. Zedekiah is called for him. Chapter 38, a bunch of people come together and they say, we need to get rid of him because if you go down to verse 4, the officials say to the king, "Now let this man be put to death, inasmuch as he is discouraging the men of war who are left in the city and all the people by speaking such words to them. For this man is not seeking the well-being of this people, but rather their harm." So the argument against Jeremiah is brought to the king. They say, "You've got to kill this guy. You've got to get rid of him because everything he says is a downer. He's depressing. And we don't have a lot of strong soldiers left, and all of them are being told by Jeremiah, surrender, give up. So we got to get rid of this guy. He's bad for morale." It's an interesting argument that I think we hear today too, right? Christianity is bad for morale. Anybody ever feel that way? The argument against Christianity and why Christians need to just be quiet about their faith is it's bad for morale. Because I feel judged by Christianity. I feel judged by the Bible. It makes me feel bad when I'm doing the things that I want to do because you've told me that God says I shouldn't be doing those things. It's discouraging. Nothing new under the sun. And so Jeremiah, he ends up being thrown in a cistern. Here's a picture of a cistern. I'm going to give you several different pictures so you can visualize in your mind. We do not know the cistern he was thrown into, so I don't have that picture. Apparently didn't have cameras back then. But here is one that was found that was about 3,000 years old. So this would be a similar time frame, give or take 100 years or so. And you can see they're large down there. A cistern is a place of holding water. That ladder there, they put there so that guy could go down there. And I left him in the picture so that you could have some context of size. Here's another one where the first one is kind of dug out and carved out. This one was more built with rocks. And then that top skylight hole there, that would be where you would access the water. So if Jeremiah was put in one like this, it might be in a where he was lowered down through a hole like that. And then here's one that is partially still has water in it. And if you look off in the far left corner, there's a scuba diver in that really nasty water. But this, what I like about this one is, it says of Jeremiah that when he was put down into the cistern, that there wasn't a lot of water left in it, so he sunk into the mud. So it tells you there was moisture enough, right? Because it can't be mud if there's no moisture at all. But it was not, drinkable water anymore. So probably less water than scuba diving cistern. But you get the idea of it would have been gross. Right? It would have been nasty, and he sinks down into the mud, and eventually when they go to pull him out, they're going to have to use rags and put them under his arms and try and yank him up. And it would have been a horrible, horrible time for Jeremiah. And so you think about Jeremiah, and he's down there in that cistern, and how could this possibly have meaning? I think it's good for us to try and think of it through the eyes of those who lived it. It's one thing to say, okay, Jeremiah got put in a cistern, and then they yanked him out eventually. But Jeremiah was, from what we can tell, in a very bad spot for a very long amount of time, so long that they thought he's just going to die down there. That's a lot of time for somebody to think. As you consider Jeremiah and him being down in the cistern, what good comes from that? Like, what's the value of us reading about Jeremiah in a cistern being stuck there? Okay, so one aspect of it is every good deed gets punished, or no good deed goes unpunished. If you do the right thing, some people aren't going to like it. That's one aspect. What's another aspect of that we learn from him? Yes. What? Say it. Okay. So another aspect is for us to realize he didn't stay in the mud, right? Yeah, and it's no different than when we talk about the valley of shadow of death, right? There's a word picture. When we talk about going through the valleys of life, sometimes you're in the mud pits of life, right? And it's messy, and it's nasty, and it's lonely, and it's dirty, and there doesn't seem any reason to have any hope, and you feel like you're atrophying. But I like it. Anything else? Yeah. Must be worth it. Yeah. God seemed to think so, right? He didn't. I don't see anywhere in the text where God finds joy in the suffering of his saints. Do you? I don't see anywhere in the text where that is enjoyable for him. So if Jeremiah is suffering like this, it must be worth it. Worth it to God's work, worth it to Jeremiah, who is counted amongst the forever faithful. So when we look at these things that they went through that are far worse than what we go through, if it was worth that, then maybe it's worth the inconveniences that we go through. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. Yep. What he calls momentary and light is not what we think of. Oh, I can think of things that I've gone through, and I had an old preacher, I was just whining to him. That's what I was doing. I had a few things going wrong, and he said, do you know what you're going through would be like to Paul? I go, no. And he grabbed my finger, and he goes, he says, that's Paul level. And I just shut my mouth and I left. Because there is something, context, right? Context to the troubles we have in life. We gripe about the traffic and, Oh, I can't believe this is going on or that is going on. And man, context. So absolutely. We may have figurative mud pits. He had real mud pit, right? Okay, anything else? Okay, so then we're going to grab chapter 39. And once again, as you've noticed, we're not going word for word through this, but in chapter 39, Jerusalem falls. And as it is captured, Zedekiah is captured. And if you remember, Jeremiah said, you will die in peace. You will not die by the sword in this siege. Well, chapter 39 says that he was captured. And in verse 6, the king of Babylon, who's the king of Babylon, by the way? Nebuchadnezzar, right? So, king of Babylon. This is the same guy you read about in Daniel. So don't mess with Nebuchadnezzar. This is my point here. Because what does he do to him? He slew the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes at Riblah. The king of Babylon also slew all the nobles of Judah. And then he blinded Zedekiah's eyes and bound him in fetters of bronze to bring him to Babylon. Literally, he kills his kids before him and then puts out his eyes. The last thing he sees on this earth is the death of his children. Don't mess with Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he doesn't die, right? But if you look at the prophecy in Ezekiel's version of this, Ezekiel will point out that you will go to Babylon of Zedekiah. You go to Babylon, but you will not see it. You'll go to Babylon, but you will not see it. So sometimes things are a little bit more complicated. Remember, I told you Zedekiah is complicated, so is the end of his life. It's complicated. So he'll die with honors, he'll die in peace, but he had a really rough journey along the way. But Babylon will capture Jerusalem, and after it has been captured, Jeremiah will be spared. He won't die, but after Jerusalem is captured, Jeremiah is going to write one more book. What book? Lamentations, which will record in detail not what happened as much as how he felt about what happened. And so you can look here at chapter 39 and you're getting the details of the physical events that happened. But in Lamentations, if you want to know how Jeremiah felt when that happened, that's where you go. So at the very end of chapter 39, we find that Jeremiah is allowed, he's spared, he's not put to death. Nebuchadnezzar likes him. And so in chapter 40, we'll see the end of the story with Jeremiah starting next week. Any comments or questions before we shut down? Okay, great. Thank you.